Good morning, everyone. Welcome again. As you all know, in previous lecture we were discussing classical conditioning. The experiment we have discussed about dog and conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus we were discussing. Here is about unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and conditioned response. Conditioned stimulus is bell, and unconditioned stimulus is foot. A stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, are stimulus that causes a response that is automatic, not learned. An unconditioned response means caused by an unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned response, a learned response to a neutral stimulus. Neutral stimulus is here means conditioned stimulus means bell. Example is bell. Neutral stimulus example is bell. So, I want to explain here the learning situation. It is obvious that if the learning situation in classical conditioning is one of SS learning, means stimulus learning, in which one stimulus means sound of bell becomes a signal for another stimulus means food. When stimulus signifies the possible occurrence of another stimulus. Examples of classical conditioning around in everyday life. Imagine you have just finished your lunch and you are feeling satisfied. Then you see some sweet dish served on the adjoining table. This signals its taste in your in mouth and triggers the secretion of saliva. You feel like eating it. This is a conditioned response means CR. Let us take another example. In the early stages of childhood, one is naturally afraid of any loud noise. Suppose a small child catches an inflated balloon which bursts in his or her hands, making a loud noise. The child becomes afraid. Now, the next time she or he is made to hold a balloon, it becomes a signal or cue for noise or elicits fear response. This happens because of contiguous presentation of balloon as a conditioned stimulus and loud noise as an unconditioned stimulus. Loud noise is here unconditioned stimulus. Now let's discuss about. Here is again stimulus response. Conditioned stimulus means a previous neutral stimulus that causes a conditioned response. And conditioned emotional responses are classically conditioned to a previous neutral stimulus. Now, next is determinants of classical conditioning. How quickly and strongly a cohesion of response occurs in a classical conditioning depends on several factors. Some of the major factors influencing learning or CR means conditioned response, are described below as you can see here on screen in determinants of classical conditioning. First factor is time relations between stimuli. The classical conditioning procedure and discussed we have already discussed about that are basically of four types based on type relation between the onset of conditioned stimulus means CS and unconditioned stimulus US or UCS we can say. The first three are called forward conditioning procedure and the fourth one is called backward conditioning procedure. Means here you can see on screen simultaneous conditioning, delayed conditioning, trace conditioning and backward conditioning. The first three are forward conditioning and last one is backward conditioning. So first one is simultaneous conditioning. When the CS and US are presented together, it is called simultaneous condition. When CS and US or UCS are presented together, it is called simultaneous conditioning. And delay conditioning is the onset of CS precedes the onset of US. The CS ends before the end of US. The CS ends before the end of US. That is delayed conditioning. Third one is trace conditioning. The onset and end of CS precedes the onset of US with some time gap between the two. There is a time gap between the two. Next one is backward conditioning. In backward conditioning, the US precedes the onset of CS. The US precedes the onset of CS. That is backward conditioning. Next one we will discuss before that. It is now well established that delayed conditioning procedure is the most effective way of acquisition of CR. Simultaneous and trace conditioning procedure to lead to acquisition of CR, but they require greater number of acquisition trials in comparison to the delayed conditioning procedure. It may be noted that the acquisition of response under backward conditioning procedure is very rare. Next factor is type of unconditioned stimuli. First is appetitive and aversive. Second one is aversive. The unconditioned stimuli used in studies of classical conditioning are basically of two types. As I already told, appetitive and aversive. Appetitive unconditioned stimuli automatically elicits approach responses such as eating, drinking, caring, etc. These responses give satisfaction and pleasure. On the other hand, aversive US, such as noise, bitter taste, electric shock, painful injections are the painful, harmful, and elicit avoidance and escape responses. Escape responses these are. It has been found that appetitive classical conditioning is slower and requires greater number of acquisition trials, but aversive classical conditioning is established in 1, 2, or 3 trials depending on the intensity of aversive US. As I gave you a child example who are using matchbox. And third one is intensity of conditioned stimuli. This influences the course of both appetitive and aversive classical conditioning. More intense conditioned stimuli are more effective in accelerating the acquisition of conditioned responses. It means that the more intense the conditioned stimulus, the fewer are the number of acquisition trials needed for conditioning. So these are some determinants of classical conditioning we have discussed today. Next time we will discuss operant conditioning. Thank you.